Agawam, Massachusetts, a quiet New England town where April evenings fall soft and slow. But in 1992, one of those nights would become the beginning of a mystery that haunted the community for 25 years, a case that shook the sense of safety residents once took for granted, and a tragedy that would forever etch a name into the history of American true crime. In the early 1990s, Agawam was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where families left doors unlocked, and where the biggest nightly concern was a distant siren or the hum of passing cars. It was a peaceful suburb of Springfield bordered by wide stretches of woods, small businesses, and quiet residential streets. The kind of town where children walked to school, where families gathered on front lawns, and where the rhythm of life felt predictable and deeply secure. To many who lived there, the world outside might have been unpredictable, but Agawam felt safe, stable, comfortable. It was a corner of Massachusetts where bad things didn't happen, where real fear felt distant. But everything changed on the night of April 15, 1992. It began as an ordinary Wednesday evening, a simple work night for a young woman who was known and loved across the community. There were no warning signs, no alarms, nothing to suggest that within hours the town would be thrown into panic, and the everyday peace residents depended on would collapse. Late that night, at a small local business, Brittany's Card and Gift Shop, something was terribly wrong. The shop, usually locked promptly at closing, was found open. The lights were still on. Music played softly inside. A purse lay untouched. A car sat quietly in the parking lot. And yet, the young woman working inside was gone. No struggle heard, no explanation visible. Just absence, sudden and chilling. For the first time in decades, Agawam felt fear in its streets. Word spread quickly, first through whispers, then through phone calls, then through news broadcasts that would capture the attention of the entire region. An investigation began before dawn, and with each passing hour, the unsettling realization deepened. Something terrible had happened, and no one knew to whom, how, or why. Families locked their doors that night. Parents held their children closer. People who had always felt protected looked over their shoulders with a new, unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. In a community built on trust, uncertainty became a silent intruder. This was not just a missing person case. It was the moment the town changed forever. The disappearance of 24-year-old Lisa Ziegert would become one of the most painful mysteries in Massachusetts history, a case that would span a quarter of a century, with answers that seemed always just out of reach, a case that would test investigators, unite a community, and challenge faith in the safety of everyday life. For years, the story of what happened that night would echo through classrooms, living rooms, and church gatherings. People would ask the same questions over and over. Who took her? Where was she? Would the truth ever be found? And worst of all, why? What began as a hopeful search soon became a haunting uncertainty. And for 25 years, the name Lisa Ziegert would symbolize not only tragedy, but resilience, determination, and the unwavering belief that justice, no matter how delayed, must come. Tonight, we revisit the story that changed Agawam. Not to reopen a wounds, but to honor a life, to recognize a community's endurance, and to follow the path investigators walked, one that ultimately led to answers thought lost in time. This is True Crime Unforgettable, and this is the story of the murder of Lisa Ziegert and the 25-year search for the truth.
To understand the weight of what was lost, we must first understand who Lisa Ziegert was. Because long before her name was printed in headlines and spoken in courtrooms, she was simply Lisa, a daughter, a sister, a teacher's aide, a friend, and a bright light in the lives of countless people who knew her. In 1992, Lisa was 24 years old, living with a sense of purpose uncommon for someone so young. She grew up in a loving family in Agawam, where compassion and responsibility were values taught early and lived deeply. Those who knew her described her as gentle, warm, and endlessly patient, an old soul with a natural ability to lift hearts, calm fears, and encourage others to try again, even on their hardest days. She worked full-time as a teacher's aide in Agawam Middle School, supporting special education students, children who often needed extra guidance, attention, and someone who believed in them. And Lisa believed in them completely. Colleagues later spoke about the way she connected with students others had struggled to reach. She listened, she understood, she never raised her voice, and she saw potential in every child who entered her classroom. Many students remembered her as the person who made school feel safe, who helped them find confidence, and who reminded them that success wasn't measured by perfection, but by effort. Even decades later, former students would describe her not as someone they simply knew, but as someone who shaped their lives. Outside of school, Lisa worked a second job at Brittany's Card and Gift Shop, a small, friendly business in a quiet shopping plaza. She worked the evening shift 4 nights a week, balancing her jobs with the same dedication she gave every part of her life. The shop was well known in town, especially around holidays, offering cards, seasonal gifts, and small keepsakes that residents bought for birthdays, celebrations, and everyday kindness. People often came in just to talk to Lisa. She greeted everyone with kindness. She remembered faces, she remembered stories, she cared. Friends described her sense of humor as light and thoughtful, the kind that could ease tension in a room without ever drawing attention to herself. She was artistic, creative, and talented. She had dreams of becoming a full-time educator and using art to help students express themselves. She loved music, loved spending time with friends and family, and cherished the simple joys of everyday life, traditions, celebrations, and the comfort of routine. Lisa's parents, George and Dee, and her sister Lynn, were the core of her world. Their home was filled with laughter, support, and pride in the person she was becoming. They believed she was destined to make a difference, not in loud or extraordinary ways, but through small acts of compassion, through patience and generosity, through lifting others quietly and consistently. That was who Lisa was. She wasn't a public figure. She wasn't a person seeking attention. She wasn't someone living a risky or complicated life. She was simply a young woman who loved her family, her students, and her community, and who gave more than she asked for in return. And that is what makes what happened next so painful to understand. There was nothing dramatic about the night she went to work. It was just another ordinary Wednesday. She finished her day helping students at the middle school, and then she drove to Brittany's Card and Gift Shop for her regular evening shift. She was scheduled to close the store, something she routinely and responsibly managed without concern. When she left home that afternoon, there was no sign that anything would be different, no reason for anyone to worry, no warning. In a town that believed good things happened to good people, and that kindness was a shield strong enough to protect those who offered it, Lisa represented the very best of Agawam. She embodied the values the town took pride in: trust, friendship, and the belief that people look out for one another. Her disappearance would become a turning point, not just because of the mystery surrounding it, but because of who she was, because the loss was personal. Deeply personal. It wasn't just a crime. It was a heartbreak, a fracture in the identity of a community that believed it was safe. For 25 years, whenever residents spoke of the case, they didn't speak first of evidence or timelines or theories. They spoke of Lisa. They spoke of the smile that lit up a classroom, of a voice that encouraged children to believe in themselves, of kindness that could not be replaced. Her story mattered. Her life mattered. And from the moment she was reported missing, there was no question. The community would fight to bring her home and to seek justice, no matter how long it took. Because when someone like Lisa disappears, an entire town feels the absence.
Wednesday, April 15th, 1992. An evening that began like countless others in Agawam. Quiet streets, lights glowing softly through shop windows, and the familiar rhythm of small-town routine. For many residents, it was just another midweek night. But for investigators, historians, and the community that would spend decades searching for answers, it would become the most important timeline they would ever examine. That afternoon, after finishing her work at Agawam Middle School, Lisa drove to Brittany's card and gift shop to begin her shift. The store, located in a modest strip mall along Route 159, was the kind of place locals visited for greeting cards, small gifts, and seasonal decorations. It was warm, welcoming, and known for friendly service, much of it shaped by Lisa's presence behind the counter. She arrived for her shift as scheduled. Co-workers later confirmed that everything about the start of the evening was normal. Customers came and went, browsing shelves, making small purchases, chatting briefly before returning to their routines. There were no reports of unusual behavior, no complaints, no raised voices, and no calls for assistance. Nothing that suggested anything out of the ordinary. Lisa was working alone that night, something she had done many times before. The shop typically closed at 9 p.m. and closing procedures were simple. Lock the door, shut down the register, turn off the lights, and secure the store before heading home. But some time between the last customer leaving and the store's usual closing time, something happened behind those glass doors. At approximately 9 p.m., a coworker drove by the shop and noticed that the lights were still on, even though the store should have been closed for the night. At first, it might have seemed like a simple mistake. Perhaps Lisa was finishing paperwork or preparing displays. But when the same coworker returned later and saw the light still burning, concern began to grow. Shortly after 11 p.m., another employee arrived to check on the store. What they found was alarming. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the lights were on, music continued to play softly through the store's speakers. Display shelves remained undisturbed. Nothing appeared broken or damaged. There were no overturned items, no visible signs of a struggle or forced entry. The cash register was still in place. And yet the most critical detail was immediately clear. Lisa was gone. Her car remained parked just outside the store, exactly where she always left it. Her belongings, including her purse and jacket, were still inside the shop. Items a person leaving willingly or safely would never have abandoned. It was as if she had simply vanished. The coworker attempted to reach her, hoping for an explanation, a phone call, a note, anything to suggest she had stepped away briefly, but there was nothing. Within minutes, the store's owner and the police were notified. Officers arrived quickly, moving through the building with care, searching for any sign that might explain what had happened. They examined the store, the parking lot, and the surrounding area, but that night they found no trace of where Lisa had gone. As word spread through her family, immediate concern turned into urgency. Lisa was not someone who would leave work without a message. She was not someone who disappeared without telling someone where she was going. And she was never someone who failed to come home. By midnight, the situation was clear. Something was terribly wrong. Police secured the shop, preserving the scene. Calls were made. Search efforts began to form. The quiet suburban evening that had begun like any other now carried a heavy, unsettling silence. For those first few hours, there were far more questions than answers. The locked routine of a predictable night had been broken without warning, and with every minute that passed, the fear deepened. For her family, her co-workers, her students waiting for class the next morning, and the town that suddenly found itself awaking into a nightmare.
The next day would bring search teams, news reports, and volunteers flooding the area with determination and hope. But in those first moments, standing inside a brightly lit store that should have been dark and secured, investigators understood a truth that would echo for decades. Lisa had not simply left. Something had happened to her. And from that night forward, Agawam would never again be the same.
By the light of early Thursday morning, the gravity of the situation was unmistakable. Lisa Ziegert was missing, and every passing hour without contact deepened the fear that something unthinkable had occurred. What began as concern among co-workers and family quickly escalated into a full-scale search effort that would mobilize an entire community. Agawam police, supported by neighboring agencies, began organizing search operations before dawn. Officers and detectives revisited the gift shop, reviewing every detail inside and outside the building, preserving evidence, documenting the scene, and interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual the night before. Word of Lisa's disappearance spread rapidly, first through phone calls and then across local news outlets. By midday, reporters were on scene, broadcasting updates throughout Massachusetts. Residents who had never met Lisa began calling police, offering information, volunteering time, and asking what they could do to help. The case would soon grow beyond a missing person report. It was becoming a statewide search. Family members stood at the center of the unfolding crisis, exhausted, terrified, and desperate for answers. Together, they worked closely with law enforcement, providing information about Lisa's routines, her relationships, her habits, and anything that could help narrow the search. Her parents, George and Dee, refused to lose hope, and the people of Agawam refused to let them stand alone. Volunteers arrived by the hundreds. Friends, neighbors, teachers, students, and strangers formed search groups combing through wooded areas, fields, and roadside ditches. Flyers with Lisa's photograph appeared on telephone poles, storefront windows, gas stations, and community bulletin boards. Businesses donated supplies. Churches opened their doors for prayer and support. The community united in determination. For investigators, time was critical. Every hour mattered. Teams canvassed the neighborhood around the gift shop, interviewed customers and nearby business owners, and checked security procedures wherever they could. Roadblocks were set up, asking drivers if they had seen anything unusual the night before. Tips were collected and evaluated, each one added to a growing list that would soon stretch into the thousands. But as the hours turned into a long first day, the search brought no answers. There was no sign of Lisa, no witness who had seen her leave, no lead strong enough to reveal what had happened inside that brightly lit gift shop on Wednesday night. The absence of evidence was frustrating, painful, and deeply alarming. By Friday and into the weekend, search teams expanded farther outward. Helicopters scanned the region from above, K-9 units were deployed, state police resources were brought in to strengthen the operation. Every possible strategy was pursued. Still, nothing surfaced. The people of Agawam continued to hold on to the hope that Lisa would be found safe. Candlelight vigils began forming, quiet gatherings filled with prayer and disbelief. Students from the middle school where she worked were confused and afraid, struggling to understand how someone who made them feel safe could now be lost without explanation. The tone in the community shifted from unease to heartbreak. Uncertainty became a constant presence. Everyday life paused. Conversations moved from casual greetings to nervous questions. And for the first time in years, residents felt afraid to leave doors unlocked or walk alone after dark. By the fourth day of searching, tension hung heavy in the air. People were exhausted, but they would not stop. They searched every path, every clearing, every roadside, every place they believed she could be. And then, late Sunday afternoon, the news everyone feared arrived.
Searchers discovered Lisa's body in a wooded area in Agawam, a place only a few miles from where she was last seen. The announcement spread quickly, carried through television broadcasts, radio updates, and phone calls that left families in tears, unable to speak. The search was over. The hope of bringing Lisa home alive was gone. A wave of grief flooded the community. Grief so deep and so widespread that even those who had never met her felt the weight of the loss. Churches filled with mourners. Schools fell silent. The gift shop where she had spent her final hours closed, its lights turned off, its windows dark. And something else shifted permanently. The disappearance of a kind and gentle 24-year-old teacher's aide became a homicide investigation, one of the most significant and emotionally devastating cases the state had seen in years. The focus now turned to justice. Who was responsible? Where were the answers? How could something like this happen here? Investigators vowed they would not rest. The community promised they would not forget. And the search, though changed forever, was far from over.
4 days after Lisa was reported missing, the search that had consumed Agawam reached a heartbreaking and irreversible turning point. It was Sunday, April 19, 1992. The 4th day of continuous searching, 4 days without rest, 4 days of worry, 4 days of fear stretching through every home, every classroom, every quiet moment of the community. By then, hundreds of volunteers and multiple law enforcement agencies had combed through neighborhoods, forests, waterways, and countless miles of open land. Search maps covered folding tables at temporary command posts. Each circle drawn represented hope. Each area crossed out represented another painful moment of uncertainty. On that Sunday afternoon, search teams were moving through a wooded area off Route 159 in Agawam, a place remote enough that few ever passed through, yet close enough to town that it was reachable within minutes. It was one of the many locations identified during the expanding search perimeter. Volunteers and officials worked side by side, moving slowly through brush and uneven ground, determined not to overlook anything. And then, quietly and suddenly, everything changed. Searchers located the body of 24-year-old Lisa Ziegert. She was found in a wooded area, partially concealed from view. The discovery was handled immediately and with the highest level of respect and procedure. Investigators secured the scene, closing off the area, documenting the location with extreme care. The site was treated as a critical crime scene, and no detail was disturbed without proper forensic control. The announcement reached command units quickly. Within minutes, the reality began to spread. First through law enforcement channels, then through the networks of volunteers waiting for instruction, and finally into the community itself. Word moved not through shouts, but through silence, the kind that fell heavily over groups of searchers who moments earlier had still believed a miracle was possible. There were no sirens in the moment the news reached the town, no dramatic reaction, just heartbreak, quiet, stillness, and the painful acceptance that hope had turned to loss. For the Ziegert family, the confirmation was devastating. After days of holding on to the belief that Lisa would be found alive, the truth was now undeniable. Their daughter, their sister, the center of their world, was gone. In public statements later, they spoke only with grace, thanking the community for supporting them and asking for privacy as they grieved, a request that the people of Agawam honored with deep respect. Throughout the town, that Sunday became a day people would never forget. Churches opened their doors even though regular services had ended hours earlier. Candles were lit, strangers hugged each other, unable to find words strong enough to name the sorrow they felt. Flags were lowered, storefronts closed early.
The plaza where the gift shop stood was silent and still. In homes across Massachusetts, families sat together watching evening news broadcasts, listening as anchors spoke carefully about the discovery. For many, tears came before understanding. The story had moved far beyond the boundaries of a single town. People across the region felt the grief of a community forever changed. Schools prepared to face the unimaginable challenge of returning students to classrooms where Lisa's presence had always meant safety and comfort. Teachers discussed how to support children struggling to process the reality of loss. Counselors prepared to help students who didn't yet have the vocabulary to express what they felt. For many children, this was the first time they realized that tragedy could touch people they loved, even in places they believed were safe. For investigators, the discovery shifted the case from a desperate search to a homicide investigation, one that, from that moment forward, would shape careers, challenge forensic science, and become one of the longest and most determined investigations in New England history. Police now faced an urgent question. Who would do this to Lisa? Evidence from the discovery site was collected carefully. The area was analyzed extensively, documented with precision, and examined by forensic specialists. Physical evidence was taken and processed. Among that evidence was DNA, preserved, cataloged, and safeguarded for future use. It was an essential piece of the investigation, one that would one day become the key to unlocking the truth. In the days following the discovery, investigators held press conferences outlining the shift in the case and reaffirming their commitment to finding the person responsible. They did not promise immediate answers, only perseverance. They emphasized the importance of public cooperation and encouraged anyone with even the smallest piece of information to come forward. And people did. Tips arrived in overwhelming numbers. Residents who had seen unusual cars, unfamiliar faces, or anything they once dismissed as insignificant now stepped forward. Investigators reviewed each submission carefully, mindful that the answer might be hidden in something small. Through it all, the tone of the community remained united. Grief did not turn into blame or chaos. Instead, it became determination. People lit candles in their windows at night, holding silent vigil. Ribbons and signs appeared across Agawam, honoring Lisa's memory. Donations were collected for her family. Support came from schools, churches, newsrooms, and neighboring towns. Even in heartbreak, the community refused to let darkness replace compassion. But beneath the unity lay a profound and lasting fear. Parents watched their children more closely. People stopped walking alone after sunset. Doors once left unlocked were now secured with chains and alarms. A sense of innocence, an unspoken security that had defined the culture of the town, was gone. For many, the discovery of Lisa's body marked the end of their belief that terrible things couldn't happen in their town. And for 25 years, the question of who had taken Lisa and why would continue to haunt Agawam. The case was now officially a murder investigation, one that would stretch farther and deeper than anyone imagined, one that would exhaust traditional leads, navigate complex forensic challenges, and ultimately rely on scientific advances that did not yet exist. The search for answers was not over. It had only changed. The fight for justice, for Lisa, for her family, and for the town that loved her, was just beginning.
The discovery of Lisa Ziegert's body transformed the case instantly and permanently. What had begun as a missing person search became one of the most determined and far-reaching homicide investigations in Massachusetts history, and it would continue not for months or years, but for a full quarter-century. 25 years of work, 25 years of questions, 25 years that tested the limits of investigative endurance. In the days following the discovery, The Massachusetts State Police Major Crime Unit joined Agawam Police in leading the investigation. Detectives began constructing a detailed timeline of Lisa's final hours, interviewing every possible witness, collecting forensic evidence, and seeking any clue that could identify the person responsible. From the beginning, investigators faced a challenge that would define the case. There was no immediate suspect. There were no eyewitnesses who saw Lisa leave the store. No cameras in the area captured the events. The store showed no forced entry. Her car was untouched, and Lisa herself left behind no message or indication of who she may have encountered that night. Detectives conducted hundreds of interviews within the first weeks. They spoke with customers who visited the store that day, employees from neighboring businesses, friends, co-workers, family members, and members of the public who came forward with information. Anyone who might have seen something unusual was asked to recount every detail, no matter how small. Police built timelines, mapped movements, and cross-checked statements again and again, searching for patterns or inconsistencies. The case grew rapidly. Leads poured in. Tips arrived by phone, by letter, and in person as residents searched their memories for anything that could help. Some leads were promising, others quickly proved unrelated. Still, nothing was dismissed casually. Every possibility was examined. Forensic evidence collected from the crime scene and from the gift shop was analyzed meticulously. Among that evidence, investigators recovered DNA that did not belong to Lisa, a critical piece of information that became the keystone of the ongoing case. In 1992, DNA testing was still developing, and while it could confirm whether a sample matched a specific person, it could not yet be used to search broad public databases or identify someone unknown. The technology simply did not exist. Even so, investigators understood its value. The DNA was carefully preserved, documented, and stored under controlled conditions, kept safe for future use. Over the next months, police obtained DNA samples from numerous individuals who were interviewed or voluntarily came forward. Each sample was compared to the evidence. One by one, those comparisons were ruled out. There was no match. The case continued forward, driven by a combination of forensic science, public cooperation, and unwavering persistence. But as months turned into years, the investigation became more complex. Leads that once seemed promising dissolved into dead ends. Tips slowed. Interviews were revisited. Evidence was re-examined. And still, the identity of the person responsible remained unknown. Yet the case did not fade. Every year, detectives returned to the evidence, reviewing reports, re-interviewing witnesses, and following new investigative paths as they emerged. Crime scene files expanded into thousands of pages. Boxes of carefully organized records filled storage rooms. New detectives joined the effort, carrying forward the work of those before them. Each generation of investigators treated the case not as history, but as responsibility. The community never forgot. Residents continued to attend vigils honoring Lisa's memory. Fundraisers supported search and recovery programs. Churches held services each year around the anniversary of her disappearance. Many kept photos of Lisa in their windows, a quiet but powerful reminder that she was more than a name in a case file. She was a daughter, a teacher, a friend, and a life stolen before it could truly begin. Her family remained firmly involved throughout every year of the investigation. They attended press conferences, supported investigators, and worked to ensure that Lisa's case stayed visible and active. They never stopped asking questions, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that justice would come. As time passed, the investigation grew to include new tools. Forensic methods advanced dramatically during the 1990s and early 2000s. Techniques for DNA extraction improved, laboratory accuracy strengthened. New systems for storing and comparing DNA evidence were created, including national databases that allowed law enforcement agencies across the country to share and match genetic profiles. Each advancement gave new life to cases once thought impossible to solve. Again and again, as new techniques became available,
investigators submitted Lisa's preserved DNA for testing. Each time, they hoped the technology had advanced enough to reveal the identity of the person responsible. Each time, when results came back without a match, they continued forward, disappointed but not defeated. Cold case units reviewed the file repeatedly. Detectives held periodic press briefings, reminding the public that the case was still active. Media outlets revisited the story at key anniversaries, publishing timelines, interviews, and appeals for new information. Students who had once known Lisa grew up and became parents themselves. Some became educators inspired by her memory. Yet through it all, the central question remained unanswered. Who killed Lisa Ziegert? And would the truth ever be found? The passage of time complicated the investigation in ways that cannot be understated. Memories faded. People moved away. Witnesses grew older. Leads that once seemed promising became increasingly difficult to verify. But the evidence, especially the DNA, remained unchanged. Waiting. By the mid-2010s, forensic science had progressed far beyond what investigators in 1992 could have imagined. Laboratories had developed advanced DNA comparison methods capable of generating suspect profiles from even small or degraded samples. Scientists were now able to analyze genetic markers with far greater precision and to compare them against rapidly expanding databases in ways never before possible. In 2017, the decision was made to pursue a new strategy using cutting-edge DNA technology that did not exist at the time of the crime. Specialists employed a sophisticated technique known as phenotype-based DNA analysis, which could generate a predicted physical profile from a crime scene DNA sample, estimating characteristics such as hair color, skin tone, eye color, and facial structure based solely on genetic markers. The results provided a clearer image of the type of individual investigators were looking for. From there, law enforcement pursued a targeted review of individuals who aligned with the profile. New attention was given to past interview subjects. Investigators revisited the large list of names collected over decades of work, looking again at those who had once been questioned and cleared, not because they were suspect, but because technology now allowed for deeper comparison than ever before. For the first time in 25 years, a major shift was underway, a turning point shaped not by chance or confession, but by science. A suspect emerged through the DNA comparison process, and in 2017, investigators identified the individual whose DNA matched the evidence collected in 1992. After 25 years of waiting, the moment finally arrived. The DNA profile matched that of Gary E. Shara, a man who had lived in Massachusetts at the time of the crime and who had been loosely connected to the case early in the investigation, but who had never been charged or identified as a primary suspect until advances in DNA technology revealed the connection. With that breakthrough, the case left the realm of uncertainty and entered the final pursuit of justice. Within days, investigators located and arrested Shara, and after decades of pain, uncertainty, and unanswered questions, the truth was finally within reach. The journey to this point had been long. It had demanded patience, endurance, innovation, and unshakable belief. It had carried countless investigators across years of work, thousands of hours, and the full span of scientific transformation in forensic history. But at last, the case was no longer unsolved. The fight for justice that began on an April night in 1992 was about to reach its conclusion.
For 25 years, the investigation into the murder of Lisa Ziegert stood as one of Massachusetts' most enduring unsolved cases. A case preserved through decades of tireless police work, unwavering community support, and an unbreakable commitment from her family. And although thousands of hours had been invested and countless leads pursued, the identity of the person responsible remained unknown, an unanswered question suspended in time. But science was changing, and in the world of forensic investigation, time does not weaken evidence, it strengthens opportunity. The DNA collected in 1992, carefully preserved, protected, stored, and revisited again and again, remained untouched by the passing of years. It waited for the moment when technology would finally advance enough to unlock what it contained. While investigators continued their search by traditional methods, the future of the case quietly rested in a test tube, holding the silent truth that no witness could provide. By 2017, forensic DNA science had entered a new era. The tools available to investigators now bore little resemblance to those available in the early 1990s. Laboratories could analyze smaller, older, and more complex samples. Genetic markers could be studied with remarkable accuracy, and advanced techniques made it possible to generate three-dimensional composite predictions of a suspect's appearance. This emerging field, known as DNA phenotype profiling, could determine likely physical characteristics based on genetic structure, eye color, hair color, skin pigmentation, facial build, and ancestry. For investigators long stalled in darkness, this technology offered something they had not possessed in nearly 3 decades, a window into who they were searching for. The decision was made to apply the latest DNA technique to the evidence collected from Lisa's case. The Massachusetts State Police partnered with forensic experts specializing in phenotype analysis to produce a scientifically generated profile of what the unidentified suspect would likely have looked like in 1992. When the results returned, they provided a clearer image, a predicted facial structure, age range, and physical description backed not by speculation, but by genetic science. This new visual profile prompted investigators to revisit hundreds of names already documented throughout the case over the years, names collected from interviews, tips, background reviews, and voluntary DNA submissions. With renewed focus, detectives reassessed connections, reviewing every person whose identity, history, or proximity to the area might align with the phenotype results. Among those names was Gary E. Shara, a resident of West Springfield and a man loosely connected to the case decades earlier, though never identified as a primary suspect. Investigators had briefly crossed paths with Shara in the early months of the investigation, after his then-wife contacted police with general concerns about statements he had made regarding the crime. At the time, police attempted to reach him, but circumstances surrounding his schedule and availability prevented an in-person interview, and the lead faded among the thousands of others developing that year. With no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and no confessions or testimony establishing involvement, he remained one name among many, neither confirmed nor excluded. But in 2017, that changed. Armed with the newly generated DNA phenotype results, investigators took a fresh look at Shara's previous mention in the case. They reviewed background records, personal history, and geographic connections, and determined that his name warranted closer examination under modern forensic capability. Detectives obtained a DNA sample connected to Shara through lawful procedures and submitted it for direct comparison against the DNA found in Lisa's case. And then, after 25 years of uncertainty, science delivered the answer investigators had waited for. The DNA profiles matched. The sample taken in 2017 corresponded precisely with the DNA collected in 1992, a definitive scientific connection. The identity of the individual responsible for Lisa's murder was no longer unknown. The silence of decades was broken in a single conclusive result. Following the match, investigators moved swiftly. A warrant was authorized for the arrest of Gary E. Shara, who at the time of the DNA breakthrough was in his late 40s and residing in Connecticut. When law enforcement attempted to locate him, they discovered he had left the state. Shortly afterwards, they learned that Shara had been hospitalized in Connecticut after an apparent overdose attempt. Alongside him, in his possession, investigators recovered written documents, letters that acknowledged his involvement in Lisa's murder. Within days, after recovering medically, Shara was taken into custody by law enforcement officers. He was transported back to Massachusetts to face charges including murder, kidnapping, and aggravated rape. After 25 years, an arrest had finally been made. The news spread across Massachusetts with incredible force. On television, headlines announced the breakthrough. Online, messages of shock, relief, and grief flooded social platforms. Newspapers published front-page summaries declaring that the case that had haunted an entire region for decades was no longer unsolved. And in Agawam, the moment brought a wave of emotion that no single word could fully describe. For Lisa's family, the breakthrough represented both devastation and deliverance. Devastation in confronting once more the reality of loss, and deliverance in finally learning the truth they had waited half a lifetime to hear. In their public statements, they expressed profound gratitude to law enforcement and to everyone who had fought for justice on behalf of their daughter. They spoke not of anger or vengeance, but of closure, the long-awaited chance to let answers replace questions. In the courtroom, Shara later entered a plea of guilty to charges including first-degree murder in connection with the death of Lisa. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence permitted under Massachusetts law. There was no trial, no defense argument seeking exoneration, no prolonged legal battle. With the guilty plea entered, the case, after 25 years, finally reached its conclusion. For investigators who had devoted years of their careers to solving the case, the DNA breakthrough was validation of persistence beyond measure. Many detectives who had worked on the case from the beginning had since retired. Some who once carried the files were no longer alive. Others had dedicated entire decades of service believing they might never see justice achieved. Yet through them all, the case survived, preserved, protected, and passed between generations of law enforcement like a mission rather than a job. And ultimately, science, paired with relentless determination, delivered the answer. In the world of true crime, the Lisa Ziegert case stands as a landmark example of the power of forensic technology to solve crimes once thought unsolvable. It demonstrates the unwavering strength of a community that refused to surrender hope. And it affirms a truth that resonates far beyond Massachusetts. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. The breakthrough did more than identify a suspect. It restored a measure of peace to a community that had carried the weight of uncertainty for a quarter-century. It demonstrated that persistence matters, progress matters, memory matters, and most importantly, Lisa mattered. She mattered to her family, to her students, to her colleagues, to her community, and to every person who never stopped asking the question, who did this to her? Through 25 years of waiting, that question shaped lives. It shaped investigations. It shaped technology. And it shaped the heart of a small town forever changed by a crime that should never have happened. The answer now belonged to history. But the impact, the emotional truth, would echo far beyond the courtroom into the homes, hearts, and memories of those who never stopped believing that someday
Somehow, the truth would speak. And when it did, it spoke through DNA.
When news broke in September 2017 that an arrest had been made in the murder of Lisa Ziegert, the announcement rippled through Agawam and the surrounding region like a shockwave. For 25 years, the case had remained a painful mystery, a wound carried quietly through generations, and a story so deeply rooted in the community that many feared it would never find resolution. But now, the uncertainty was suddenly gone, replaced by headlines that many residents had waited to see for most of their lives. For those who lived in Agawam in 1992, the announcement brought back vivid memories. The search teams moving through fields and forests, the glowing candlelight vigils, the posters with Lisa's photograph taped to storefront windows. It brought back the painfully quiet days after her body was found, and the decades of unanswered questions that seemed to deepen with every passing year. In a moment, people who had carried silence for decades were speaking again, to neighbors, to family members, to reporters, trying to process what justice, after 25 long years, truly meant. The man identified and arrested was Gary E. Shara, who was 50 years old at the time of the arrest and living in West Springfield, Massachusetts, before relocating temporarily to Connecticut. Shara had not been a prominent figure in the public discussion of the case over the years. Though his name had crossed the edges of the investigation decades earlier, he was not widely known or discussed publicly. In fact, many people in the community had never heard of him until the arrest was announced. The revelation that the suspect had lived among the community for so many years without detection was deeply unsettling for many. The idea that someone connected to such a devastating crime could continue with ordinary life unnoticed and unchallenged shook the foundations of trust in everyday familiarity. It forced people to reconcile the contrast between the peaceful image of their town and the reality that the answer had been so close, yet hidden all along. In Shara's possession at the time of his apprehension, investigators recovered written documents in which he acknowledged involvement in Lisa's death. These written statements were later referenced by officials during public briefings, confirming their authenticity and relevance to the case. Combined with the decisive DNA match, the scientific proof linking his genetic profile to evidence recovered from the crime scene in 1992, the case against him stood on firm legal ground. After being transported from Connecticut back to Massachusetts, Shara was arraigned and formally charged. The courtroom was filled with the weight of history and with faces who had spent years waiting for this moment. Law enforcement officers who had carried the case through decades of effort, members of the Ziegert family whose strength had never wavered, and residents of a community that had refused to let Lisa's story fade. Standing before the court, Shara entered a plea of guilty to the charges, which included first-degree murder. His guilty plea meant that there would be no trial. There would be no weeks of testimony, no witness questioning, no contested evidence, and no uncertainty about the outcome. Instead, the process moved swiftly, and the court issued the maximum penalty allowed under Massachusetts law, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing marked the official legal conclusion of the case, a final chapter written after 25 years of waiting. But for many, it did not bring celebration. Instead, it brought a quieter, more complex emotion. Relief, threaded through grief. Closure, balanced with sorrow. The answers they had prayed for arrived, but they arrived with the understanding that nothing could restore the life that had been taken. At the press conferences that followed, officials spoke carefully and with reverence. Investigators described the case as one of the most challenging and emotionally significant in Massachusetts history. They credited advances in forensic DNA science, persistent investigative work, and the unwavering support of Lisa's family and the community as the forces that ultimately brought justice. Many expressed admiration for the determination that had kept the case active for 25 years, refusing to allow it to fade into unsolved archives. For the Ziegert family, closure did not erase pain, but it provided finality. They expressed profound gratitude to law enforcement, thanking every investigator who had worked on the case across multiple decades. They thanked the community for never giving up hope and honoring Lisa's memory with respect and dignity through the years. And they asked that Lisa be remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived, with kindness, dedication, and a heart committed to helping others. Across Agawam, the reaction to the arrest was immediate and deeply emotional. Some residents wept openly. Others gathered in silence. Many paused to reflect, in homes, in classrooms, in churches, on the enormity of what had finally been resolved. The case had shaped the identity of the town for a generation. People who were children in 1992 were now adults, raising families of their own, and many still remembered the fear that spread through their community after Lisa disappeared. For those who had moved away, the news reached them through national outlets. Former students of Lisa's wrote messages online, thanking her for the guidance she once offered them. Families who had held candles at vigils decades earlier shared memories of those long nights standing together in the cold. Reporters who had covered the case in the 90s returned to write retrospectives honoring the persistence that led to justice. And yet another reality settled over Agawam. Justice had come late, painfully late. A quarter of a century had passed. Lives had changed. Time had moved relentlessly forward. But in the most important ways, the wait for justice had remained frozen until 2017. The arrest and conviction did not rewrite the past. It did not erase the fear the town carried or the loss that Lisa's family endured. But it did bring a sense of resolution, a closing of the circle that had remained open far too long. Most of all, it reaffirmed something powerful. The case had never been forgotten. Not by investigators, not by the community, and never, for a moment, by the people who loved her. The arrest of Gary E. Shara closed the investigative chapter of the story, but the impact, emotional, cultural, and communal, would continue far beyond the courtroom.
For 25 years, the case of Lisa Ziegert was a wound that never fully healed, a sorrow carried quietly in classrooms, in families, in church pews, and in the soft echo of unanswered questions that lingered over Agawam. The arrest and conviction finally provided closure, but closure is not the same as restoration. Time does not reverse loss. It only teaches communities how to carry it. In the years since the case was solved, the impact has continued to shape the town and the wider region. Residents often speak of April 1992 not as a date on a calendar, but as a dividing line between the world as it was and the world as it became. The tragedy changed daily life. Doors locked earlier, parents became more protective, and trust, once unquestioned, became something handled more carefully. Yet, alongside the pain, something else grew. Strength, unity, perseverance, a belief that even in the darkest circumstances, communities can rise together, refusing to surrender to fear. The long journey to justice demonstrated that answers are worth fighting for, even when they require decades of patience. The case also transformed investigative science. The breakthrough proved what was once thought impossible, that technology can reach back through time to solve crimes once considered unsolvable. Lisa's case became an example studied by forensic students, law enforcement agencies, and scientific researchers across the country. It showed how DNA, preserved with care,
and paired with unwavering determination, can become the voice of a victim when all other voices fall silent. For Lisa's family, the years since the resolution have been filled with unimaginable grief, but also with pride. Pride in who she was. Pride in the lives she touched. Pride in the legacy she left, which continues far beyond her years. They chose to remember Lisa not for the tragedy that took her, but for the kindness she shared so freely, for the children she taught, the friends she supported, and the community she helped shape through everyday acts of compassion. Her former students still speak about the encouragement she gave them, the way she made them feel seen, understood, and capable. Teachers who once worked beside her carry forward her gentle strength, and families who never met her still tell her story to their children, reminding them that one life can leave a mark deeper than time itself. Lisa's legacy is not defined by violence or loss, but by the light she brought to the world, a light that did not fade even through 25 years of darkness. The people of Agawam continue to honor her through community events, scholarship programs, memorials, and traditions meant to preserve her spirit. Her memory is part of the identity of the town, woven into its history not as a tragedy alone, but as a testament to resilience and the belief that justice must always be pursued, no matter how long it takes. And perhaps the greatest lesson of this case is the reminder that behind every headline and every file number is a real person, someone loved, someone missed, someone whose life mattered. Lisa mattered. She still matters. And today her story continues to be told, not to reopen wounds, but to ensure that courage is remembered, that persistence is honored, and that no victim is ever forgotten. Because silence never wins, because justice does not expire, because truth, even delayed, still has the power to speak. This is why we tell these stories, to carry their names forward, to refuse forgetfulness, to remind ourselves that the measure of a community is how fiercely it fights for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Lisa's story did not end the night she was taken. Her legacy lives in every voice that still speaks her name.